Jake and Lisa were exhausted, but relieved as they stepped into their new home. It wasn't a big house, but it had character, an old, charming kind of look that made it feel like it had seen some history. They had saved for years, skipping vacations and nights out, just to afford this place. It needed work, no doubt. The floors creaked, the paint was peeling in some spots, and the basement was a little creepy, but they figured it was nothing they couldn't handle. Plus, it was a fresh start and new chapter in their lives. The first few days were spent unpacking boxes, arranging furniture, and getting to know the neighborhood. The house sat on the edge of a quiet street, lined with trees that made everything feel a little secluded. Their neighbors, Bob and Nancy, lived just across the street. They were an older couple, polite but distant, the type who would wave from the porch but didn't seem interested in stopping by for a chat. That suited Jake and Lisa just fine. They weren't looking to make new best friends. They just wanted peace and quiet. But by the end of the first week, they both started feeling a little off. It was little things at first, things that they could easily brush off as the stress of moving. Jake kept hearing footsteps late at night. At first, he thought it was Lisa, getting up to use the bathroom or get a glass of water. But every time he checked, she was sound asleep beside him. He tried to ignore it, telling himself that old houses make noises. It's probably the wood settling, or maybe even the wind outside. Lisa had her own weird experiences. She kept losing things, her keys, her phone, even a couple of books she was sure she had put on the coffee table. At first, she blamed it on the chaos of moving. Things get misplaced, right? But they would show up in the strangest places. Her keys were once found in the fridge, her phone under a pile of blankets she hadn't touched, and the books were tucked neatly under the couch, a place she never would have put them. One night, as they lay in bed, Lisa brought it up. "Do you ever feel like someone else is in the house?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake hesitated. He didn't want to freak her out, but the truth was, yeah, he had felt it too. "It's just an old house," he said, trying to sound convincing. "Houses like this creak, they shift. We're probably just not used to it yet." Lisa nodded, but neither of them felt reassured. There was a strange tension in the air, like they were both avoiding talking about what they really felt. They were excited about the move, about their new life, but there was also this creeping unease that neither of them could shake. That night, Jake woke up again, hearing the same footsteps. He sat up, straining his ears, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the floors creaking. It was steady, like someone was walking through the house, slow and deliberate. His heart pounded as he reached for the light, but just as his fingers touched the switch, the sound stopped. The house was silent. He sat there for a minute, listening, waiting for the sound to start again, but it didn't. He lay back down, but sleep didn't come easy. Every time he closed his eyes, he could swear he heard the faintest creak of a floorboard, as if someone, something, was just outside the bedroom door. The next morning, he didn't mention the footsteps to Lisa. He didn't want her to worry more than she already was. But from the way she looked at him over breakfast, he could tell she wasn't sleeping well either. "Maybe it's just the stress of the move," she said more to herself than to him. "Yeah, that's probably it," Jake replied, though deep down, neither of them believed it. Something wasn't right in the house, and they both knew it, even if they weren't ready to admit it yet. Jake and Lisa were still adjusting to their new life, but the unease lingered. Their days were filled with unpacking and trying to make the house feel like home. But at night, the strange feelings only seemed to grow stronger. Jake noticed it most when things got quiet, like the house was alive in some small, unsettling way. Lisa had started avoiding being alone in the house. Whenever Jake was at work, she'd run errands or go for long drives, returning only when she knew he'd be back soon. Despite the strange vibes, they decided to try and meet their neighbors. After all, it was a small, quiet neighborhood, and making friends might help them feel more grounded. Across the street, Bob and Nancy lived in a neat, tidy home that looked like it had been untouched by time. Their lawn was always perfectly trimmed, the flowers in the garden always in bloom. It was a sharp contrast to Jake and Lisa's more rundown fixer-upper. One Saturday afternoon, Jake and Lisa decided to introduce themselves. They knocked on the door, and after a moment, Bob answered. He was in his late 60s, tall, with thinning gray hair and a kind, though somewhat reserved smile. Well, hello there, Bob greeted them, his voice friendly but distant, like he was used to keeping people at arm's length. We just moved in across the street, Jake said, extending his hand. Figure we'd come by and say hello. Bob shook Jake's hand and gave Lisa a polite nod. Nice to meet you both. I'm Bob, and this here is my wife, Nancy. At the mention of her name, Nancy appeared in the doorway. She was shorter, a bit frail-looking, with a constant smile that felt a little too forced, a little too wide. Welcome to the neighborhood, Nancy chirped, though her eyes never quite met theirs. They exchanged the usual pleasantries, talked about the weather, asked how long Bob and Nancy had lived there. Nearly 30 years, it turned out, and complimented their immaculate garden. Everything felt normal on the surface, but there was something odd about the way Bob and Nancy acted, like they were hiding something. Jake noticed how Bob glanced quickly at their house across the street, his smile tightening whenever the subject of the house came up. You two settling in all right? Bob asked, but there was a strange hesitation in his voice. Yeah, we're getting there, Jake replied. It's an old house, you know? Some weird noises here and there, but I guess that's normal for a place that old. At the mention of the noises, Nancy's smile faltered for just a second, but it was enough for Lisa to notice. Old houses do that, Nancy said quickly, her voice a little too high-pitched. They make all sorts of noises. Probably just the pipes or the floors. Yeah, I guess, Jake said, though he wasn't convinced. Bob cleared his throat, changing the subject. Well, if you ever need anything, don't hesitate to come by. We've been around here long enough. We know a bit about the area. Before Jake could ask any more about the house, Nancy stepped in. You're going to love it here, she said with that same overly bright smile. It's such a quiet neighborhood. You'll barely notice anything at all. The way she said it sent a chill down Jake's spine. Something about her words felt off, like she was trying to say more than she was letting on. But before he could press her, Bob ushered them out politely but firmly, saying they had some things to get to. As they walked back to their house, Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that Nancy had been holding something back. Did you notice how weird they got when you mentioned the noises? She asked Jake. Yeah, Jake replied. It was like they knew something but didn't want to say. They tried to laugh it off, telling themselves that maybe Bob and Nancy were just eccentric or overly private. But the encounter stuck with them. Over the next few days, things around the house only got stranger. The footsteps at night became more frequent, and Lisa continued to lose items in ways that made no sense. One morning, she found her engagement ring, which she always kept on her nightstand, inside a kitchen cabinet. She hadn't touched it for days. She told Jake about it, but all he could do was scratch his head, wondering if they were both just too stressed from the move. That evening, Jake decided to confront Bob again, hoping to get more information about the house. Maybe there was something in the history of it that could explain the strange things happening. He knocked on Bob's door, and after a few moments, the older man appeared, looking slightly annoyed. Jake, what can I do for you? Jake hesitated, feeling awkward about bringing up something so vague. I wanted to ask you about the house, he said finally. You've lived here a long time. Do you know if anything strange ever happened there? Bob's face hardened just a bit, his friendly demeanor slipping. The house is old, Jake. It's bound to feel strange at first. But no, nothing out of the ordinary. He shifted on his feet, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. You'll get used to it. Give it time. Jake wasn't satisfied with the answer, but he didn't push further. He could tell Bob wasn't going to be much help. All right, thanks, Jake muttered, heading back across the street. As he walked away, Jake glanced back over his shoulder. Bob stood at his door, watching him for a moment longer than necessary before closing it. That strange, tight feeling in Jake's gut returned. Something wasn't right. When he got home, he told Lisa what Bob had said. She just shook her head. He knows more than he's letting on. I can feel it. There's something about this place they don't want us to know. That night, the footsteps started earlier. Jake lay awake, listening as they moved slowly through the house, each creak of the floorboards sending a shiver down his spine. By the time Jake and Lisa had been in the house for 2 weeks, the unsettling feeling had grown impossible to ignore. The strange occurrences seemed to escalate. The footsteps, the misplaced objects, and the growing sense that they weren't alone in their own home. Every creak and groan of the house felt like it was hiding something just out of sight. Lisa had started keeping the lights on even during the day, her nerves frayed by the constant sense of being watched. Jake, too, was losing sleep, his mind racing every night, trying to make sense of it all. One evening, as Jake was cleaning up the basement, he stumbled upon something unexpected. The basement was mostly storage space, filled with old furniture and random junk left by the previous owners. As he pushed aside a dusty bookshelf to make room for their things, he noticed something odd. There, behind the clutter, was a door. It was small and unassuming, the kind of thing you might overlook if you weren't paying attention. But what struck Jake was that he'd never seen it before. "Hey, Lisa," Jake called up the stairs. "Come down here for a second." A few moments later, Lisa appeared at the top of the basement stairs, her brow furrowed. "What is it?" "I found something," Jake said, gesturing to the door. "Check this out." Lisa descended the stairs, her footsteps hesitant. When she saw the door, her eyes widened. "Was that always there?" she asked, the unease in her voice clear. "I don't think so," Jake replied. "I mean, I didn't notice it when we first moved in, but then again, I wasn't exactly looking for hidden doors." They both stared at the door for a long moment. It was odd, not just because it had been hidden, but because it didn't match the rest of the basement. The wood was newer, the paint chipped but not old enough to blend in with the house's natural wear and tear. Jake tried the handle. It was stiff, but after a bit of effort, it creaked open. The door led to a small, windowless room. It was empty, except for a single chair placed in the middle of the room. The walls were bare, the floor cold concrete. There was no light fixture, no sign that this room had ever been used for anything. Yet, the air felt thick, heavy, like something had been lingering in that space for years. Lisa instinctively took a step back. "I don't like this, Jake." "I know. It's weird," he admitted, stepping inside to get a closer look. "But it's just an empty room. Maybe it was a storage area or something." Lisa shook her head. "No, it doesn't feel right. Why would it be hidden? And that chair, why is it just sitting there like that?" Jake shrugged, though he couldn't deny the uncomfortable vibe the room gave off. He walked around, inspecting the walls and floor, but there was nothing unusual. No markings, no hidden compartments. Just the chair, sitting eerily in the center. "Let's lock it and forget about it," Lisa suggested, her voice tense. "I don't want to mess with it." Jake looked at her, and for the first time, he saw real fear in her eyes. She wasn't just uneasy, she was scared. "All right," he said, closing the door behind him. "We'll lock it up. It's probably nothing." They dragged the bookshelf back in front of the door, as if that would somehow keep whatever weirdness lay behind it at bay. But even after they returned upstairs, the discovery of the hidden room lingered in the back of Jake's mind. It didn't make sense. Why would someone build a small, featureless room like that and then hide it? That night, Jake had trouble sleeping. The house was quiet, but not in a comforting way. It was the kind of silence that presses on you, making every little noise feel amplified. Every time he started to drift off, he would jolt awake, convinced he'd heard something, a faint creak, a whisper of movement, something that made his skin crawl. Around 2 a.m., the footsteps started again. Slow, deliberate, just like before. They seemed louder now, like whoever or whatever was walking around was getting closer. Jake lay there, listening, his heart racing. The sound was unmistakable this time. Someone was moving downstairs, walking through the house. Lisa stirred beside him. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Yeah," Jake replied, barely audible. He sat up, his eyes fixed on the bedroom door. He could hear the footsteps moving from the hallway to the stairs, then down to the basement. "I don't like this," Lisa said, sitting up too. "Something's wrong, Jake. I don't want to stay here anymore." Jake nodded, but he didn't know what to do. They couldn't just leave in the middle of the night without a plan. He had to get to the bottom of it, figure out what was really going on in the house. But first, he needed sleep. He needed to clear his head and think. "Let's try to get some rest," Jake said, though he knew it was unlikely they'd sleep much. "We'll talk about it in the morning." Lisa reluctantly agreed, lying back down, though neither of them truly slept. The footsteps continued for a while longer before fading into the silence. But that silence wasn't reassuring. It felt like a calm before the storm. The next day, Jake couldn't stop thinking about the basement door. He tried to go about his usual routine, but his mind kept drifting back to that small, empty room and the unsettling feeling it had given him. Something was wrong with this house, and he was determined to figure out what it was. But for now, they would keep the door locked, hoping that would keep whatever was happening at bay. That night, after discovering the strange room in the basement, both Jake and Lisa struggled to find peace. They lay in bed, silent, each lost in their own thoughts. Neither of them mentioned the footsteps from the night before, but it was clear that something had shifted. The tension was thick, almost palpable, and it followed them into their sleep. Jake was the first to fall asleep, but his dreams were far from restful. In his dream, he was back in the basement, standing in front of the small door. The room felt colder than usual, and the air was heavy, like the house was holding its breath. The door was slightly ajar, and as Jake stared at it, he could feel something waiting for him inside. He pushed the door open, and there was again the chair in the middle of the room. But this time, it wasn't empty. A shadowy figure sat in the chair, its back to Jake, its form barely visible in the dim light. The figure didn't move, didn't turn to face him, but Jake could feel its presence like a weight pressing on his chest. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. All he could do was stand there, frozen, as the figure slowly raised its hand and pointed directly at him. Jake woke up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding. He sat up, gasping for breath, trying to shake off the lingering fear from the dream. The room was dark, but the feeling of being watched was still there, hovering just beyond the edge of his consciousness. He glanced over at Lisa, who was still asleep, but even in her sleep, she looked tense, her brow furrowed, her hands clenched into fists. Jake didn't wake her. Instead, he lay back down, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince himself that it was just a dream. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. The house was getting to them, seeping into their minds, playing tricks on them. Lisa's night wasn't any better. Her dream was equally vivid, equally disturbing. She was back in the small room, just like Jake. But in her dream, the walls were closer, tighter, as if the room was shrinking around her. The chair was there too, but this time, she was the one sitting in it. She tried to move, but her body felt heavy, like something was holding her down. The walls inched closer, and she could hear whispers, soft, indistinct voices, speaking in a language she couldn't understand. They were getting louder, growing more insistent, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't escape. The pressure built in her chest until it felt like she was suffocating. Just when she thought the walls would crush her, she jolted awake, gasping for air. Her hands were gripping the sheets, so tightly her knuckles were white. She looked over at Jake, who was already awake, his eyes wide with the same fear she felt. "Did you have a dream?" she whispered, her voice shaky. Jake nodded slowly. "Yeah, it was bad." They didn't need to say more. They both knew the house was responsible. The dreams weren't just dreams. They were something more, something darker. The room in the basement was at the center of it, like a wound that refused to heal. The next day, Jake and Lisa avoided talking about the dreams, but the tension between them grew. Lisa didn't want to be in the house alone, so she started leaving during the day, finding any excuse to run errands, even if they didn't need anything. She would drive around for hours just to avoid the oppressive atmosphere of the house. Jake, on the other hand, tried to keep himself busy with work. He spent hours fixing up the house, patching holes, repainting walls, anything to keep his mind occupied. But no matter how hard he worked, the feeling of unease never left him. It was always there, just beneath the surface, waiting for the moment he let his guard down. That night, the dreams returned, even more vivid than before. This time, Jake's dream was even more unsettling. He found himself in the basement again, but everything felt distorted. The walls were taller, the shadows longer. The air was thick, almost suffocating. He walked toward the door to the small room, but when he reached out to open it, his hand passed right through the handle, like it wasn't really there. The door swung open on its own, and Jake felt a cold gust of air rush past him, pulling him inside. The room was dark, darker than it should have been. The chair was gone, but in its place was something else. A figure, tall and thin, its face hidden in shadow, stood in the corner, watching him. Jake tried to back away, but his feet wouldn't move. The figure stepped closer, and as it did, a low, raspy whisper filled the room. "Get out!" Jake woke up with a start, his heart hammering in his chest. He sat up, drenched in sweat, his body trembling. He glanced over at Lisa, and she was already awake, sitting up with wide, terrified eyes. "I had the dream again," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Me too," Jake replied, his throat dry. "Something's wrong, Lisa. We need to figure out what's going on." Lisa nodded, her fear mirrored in Jake's expression. They couldn't keep ignoring it. The house wasn't just old and creaky. It was something else, something darker, something dangerous. And whatever it was getting stronger. The next day, Lisa couldn't take it anymore. She didn't want to be alone in the house, didn't want to spend another minute feeling like she was being watched. She started packing a bag, telling Jake she was going to stay with her sister for a few days, just to get away and clear her head. Jake understood, but part of him didn't want to leave. He wanted answers. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were close to figuring it out, that if they just stuck around a little longer, they'd discover the truth behind the house and the room in the basement. But as Lisa packed her things, Jake couldn't help but wonder if getting answers was worth the price they were paying. Lisa's decision to leave for a few days brought an uneasy quiet to the house. Jake tried to convince himself it was a good idea. Maybe getting some distance would help Lisa clear her head, and maybe the space would give him a chance to finally get to the bottom of whatever was going on. But as soon as she left, the house felt emptier, darker somehow. The silence pressed in on him, making every little sound seem amplified. Max, their loyal dog, seemed to sense the tension too. He had always been an energetic little guy, wagging his tail and following Jake and Lisa around the house. But lately, he had been acting strange, spending most of his time near the basement door, sniffing around and occasionally letting out a low growl, as if something on the other side of that door bothered him. Jake tried to distract him, throwing toys and offering treats, but Max always ended up back by the basement, fixated on that hidden room. The night after Lisa left, Jake stayed up late. He sat in the living room, staring at the TV, though he wasn't really watching it. His mind was elsewhere, on the basement, the dreams, the way the house seemed to shift when he wasn't paying attention. He tried to keep Max by his side, but the dog's attention kept drifting back to the basement door. Max scratched at it, whining softly, as if begging to be let inside. "Come on, Max, cut it out," Jake muttered, pulling him away. He closed the door to the basement tightly and sat back down, trying to focus on anything but the eerie feeling creeping up his spine. Around midnight, Jake decided to call it a night. He shut off the TV and headed upstairs, calling Max to follow him. But the dog didn't come. "Max!" Jake called out, his voice echoing through the empty house. He checked the kitchen, the living room, and even the backyard, but Max was nowhere to be found. Panic set in as Jake's mind immediately went to the basement. He rushed to the door, his heart pounding, and yanked it open. The light bulb at the top of the stairs flickered as he descended, his eyes scanning the dimly lit space for any sign of Max. "Max? Buddy, where are you?" Jake called out, his voice shaky. The basement was silent. Too silent. Jake's eyes darted toward the small hidden door, the one leading to the strange, empty room. It was closed, just as he had left it, but something in the air felt wrong. His heart raced as he approached it, half expecting to hear scratching or whining from the other side. But there was nothing, just that thick, suffocating silence. He stood in front of the door for a long moment, his hand hovering over the handle. Part of him didn't want to open it, didn't want to face whatever might be waiting on the other side. But he had to. Max could be in there somehow. With a deep breath, Jake grabbed the handle and pulled the door open. The room was exactly as he had left it. Small, empty, cold. The chair was still in the center, unmoved. No sign of Max. No sign of anything. Jake stepped inside, his footsteps echoing off the concrete floor. He called out for Max again, but his voice sounded muffled, almost like the room was swallowing the sound. A chill ran down his spine as he scanned the corners of the room, half expecting something to jump out at him. But the room was as still as ever. He turned to leave, but just as he reached the door, he froze. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw it, just a flicker, barely noticeable, but enough to send a jolt of fear through his body. A shadow, faint and fleeting, moved across the far wall. Jake spun around, his heart hammering in his chest. There was nothing there. The room was empty, just as it had been before. But the air felt different now, heavier, like the room was pressing in on him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. Without thinking, Jake slammed the door shut and bolted back upstairs. He locked the basement door behind him, leaning against it as he tried to catch his breath. His mind raced. Was he losing it? Had the stress of the house finally gotten to him? He spent the rest of the night searching the house for Max, but the dog had vanished without a trace. No paw prints, no barking, no sign that he had ever been there at all. Jake checked outside again, walking through the yard with a flashlight, calling Max's name until his voice was hoarse. But Max didn't come. Jake barely slept that night. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts spinning in 1,000 different directions. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the small room in the basement, the empty chair, the flicker of a shadow on the wall. And every time, the same question echoed in his mind. Where's Max? The next morning, Jake called Lisa to tell her what had happened, but he hesitated. How could he explain it? Hey, the dog disappeared in the basement, and I think I saw a shadow in the creepy hidden room sounded insane, even to him. So instead, he told her that Max had gotten out somehow, that he must have slipped through the back door when Jake wasn't paying attention. Lisa was upset, of course, but she believed him. Why wouldn't she? There was no reason not to. But Jake knew the truth. Max didn't just run away. Something had taken him, and whatever it was connected to the room in the basement. As the day wore on, Jake's dread deepened. He couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching him, waiting for him to make a move. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the lights, made his heart race. He tried to busy himself with repairs, anything to keep his mind off the basement, but it was no use. The house had him on edge, and he couldn't escape it. By the time the sun set, Jake had reached his breaking point. He knew he couldn't ignore the basement any longer. If he wanted answers, if he wanted to find Max, he had to go back down there. But this time, he wasn't going to go in blind. Jake rummaged through the garage, grabbing a flashlight and an old camcorder he had used years ago. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, but he needed proof. Proof that he wasn't losing his mind. Proof that whatever was happening in the house was real. With the camcorder in hand, Jake descended into the basement once more, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. His heart raced as he approached the hidden door, every instinct screaming at him to turn back. But he couldn't. He needed to know. He set up the camcorder, pointing it directly at the door to the small room. Then, with a deep breath, he opened the door again and stepped inside. The room was exactly as it had been the night before, empty, cold, and utterly still. But this time, Jake didn't wait for something to happen. He left the door open, set the camcorder to record, and backed out of the room. He locked the basement door behind him and went back upstairs, hoping that the camera would capture whatever was happening down there. As the hours ticked by, Jake couldn't bring himself to check the footage. He sat in the living room, staring at the basement door, waiting for something, anything, to happen. And then, just after midnight, it did. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, as Jake sat on the edge of the couch, his eyes fixed on the basement door. Every creak of the old house sent a shiver down his spine. It had been hours since he set up the camcorder, and the tension was slowly driving him mad. He kept glancing at the clock, watching the minutes tick by, waiting for midnight to arrive. Somehow, in his gut, he knew that if something was going to happen, it would happen at night. His heart pounded as he glanced down at his phone, debating whether to call Lisa. But what would he even say? "Hey, Lisa, I'm sitting here in the dark, waiting to see if our basement is haunted." It sounded ridiculous, even to him. So, he kept quiet, letting the stillness of the house weigh on him like a heavy blanket. Finally, at 12:02 a.m., Jake couldn't wait any longer. He stood up, wiping his sweaty palms on his jeans, and headed toward the basement. His footsteps echoed in the hall, the sound unnervingly loud in the silence of the night. When he reached the basement door, His hand hesitated on the knob. For a moment, he considered leaving the camera down there, forgetting about the whole thing, and moving out in the morning. But deep down, he knew he couldn't let it go. Whatever was happening in that room wasn't going to stop just because he ignored it. He took a deep breath, turned the knob, and crept down the stairs. The basement felt colder than usual, and Jake shivered, pulling his jacket tighter around him. The camcorder sat on the floor, still pointed directly at the small hidden door, its tiny red light blinking steadily. Nothing seemed out of place. The room was still, the air heavy with the thick, suffocating silence that had become all too familiar. Jake walked over to the camera, his hands shaking slightly as he stopped the recording. He stood there for a moment, just staring at the small screen, afraid to hit play. What if he found nothing? What if it was all in his head? Or worse, what if he found something he couldn't explain, something he couldn't ignore? With a deep breath, he hit play. At first, the footage was uneventful. The small room, lit only by the weak glow of the basement's single light bulb, sat empty and still. Nothing moved, nothing changed. Jake fast-forwarded, watching the minutes tick by. He was about to give up when something flickered across the screen, so brief he almost missed it. He rewound the footage, hitting play again, his heart racing. At exactly 2:03 a.m., the door to the small room slowly creaked open, seemingly by itself. The camera caught the sound of the door creaking, but the space beyond the door was pitch black, darker than it should have been. Then, just as the door fully opened, a shadowy figure flickered across the frame. It was faint like a wisp of smoke, barely visible, but Jake saw it. A tall, thin shape moved in and out of the camera's view, like it was gliding through the room. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he paused the video. His hand hovered over the rewind button, unsure if he even wanted to see it again. He pressed play once more, and this time he let the footage continue. The shadow appeared again, moving slowly across the room, as if pacing. And then it did something that made Jake's blood run cold. It stopped in front of the chair, the one in the middle of the room. The shadow sat down. For a long moment, nothing happened. The figure just sat there, unmoving, like it was waiting for something. Jake's heart pounded in his ears, his hands shaking as he watched the screen. And then, the shadow turned its head, as if it knew the camera was there. It didn't have a face, just a dark, blurry shape, but Jake could feel it watching him through the screen, like it could see him as clearly as he was seeing it. Suddenly, the camera began to glitch. The screen filled with static, and the faint outline of the figure became distorted, its shape shifting and twisting in the static. Then, in the middle of the distortion, a loud, mechanical screech filled the speakers, piercing and high-pitched, cutting through the silence of the basement like a knife. Jake jumped back, his heart racing, as the camera cut off completely. The screen went black. He stood there, staring at the now blank screen, his mind racing. It was real. Whatever was happening in the house, whatever was in that room, it wasn't just in his head. He had proof now, proof that someone was in the house with him. His hands shook as he fumbled with the camera, trying to rewind the footage. He needed to see it again, to make sure he wasn't imagining things. But as he pressed the buttons, the camera wouldn't respond. The screen stayed black, the battery completely dead. Jake cursed under his breath. He had just charged it earlier that day. There was no reason for it to die that quickly. His mind raced. He needed to get out of the basement. He needed to think. He grabbed the camera, shoved it under his arm, and bolted up the stairs, locking the basement door behind him. He stood in the hallway, breathing heavily, trying to calm his racing heart. The image of the shadow sitting in the chair, turning its head toward the camera, played over and over in his mind. He paced the living room, glancing nervously at the basement door every few seconds. What was he supposed to do now? Should he call Lisa? Should he leave the house? He didn't know where to turn, and the oppressive feeling of the house seemed to grow heavier with every passing minute. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, startling him. It was a text from Lisa. "Hey, how are you doing? Any news on Max?" Jake stared at the message, unsure how to respond. Max! In all the chaos, he'd nearly forgotten about the dog. He swallowed hard, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He didn't want to lie to her, but how could he explain what he had just seen? Still looking, he typed back, his hands trembling. Lisa responded quickly. "Don't worry, he'll turn up. Dogs are resilient. I'll be back in a couple of days." Jake didn't reply. He didn't know how to tell her the truth, that Max wasn't coming back, that something had taken him, just like it had taken whatever was in that room. And he couldn't shake the feeling that it was coming for him next. He sat on the couch, his mind spinning, trying to make sense of everything. The room, the shadow, the dreams, it was all connected. The house wasn't just haunted, it was something more. Something was in that basement, something old and dark, something that had been there long before they moved in. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. It wasn't their house anymore. It belonged to whatever was lurking in the shadows of that hidden room. And now it was waiting for him to make a move. Just as the thought crossed his mind, a loud creak echoed through the house. Jake froze, his blood turning to ice. The sound was unmistakable. It was coming from the basement door. Jake sat frozen on the couch, staring at the basement door as the creak echoed through the house. His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment he couldn't move. His mind raced, trying to convince himself that it was just the house settling, just one of those old house noises. But deep down he knew better. The house was never just settling. Not anymore. His phone buzzed again on the coffee table, but he didn't even look at it. His entire focus was on that door. The one that led to the basement. The one that led to the room with the chair. The door he knew he had locked. But now it felt like whatever was behind it was waiting, testing him, daring him to come closer. The basement had become the center of everything, and Jake felt it calling to him, pulling at him like a magnet. He wanted to leave, to grab his keys and get out of the house without looking back. But a part of him knew that if he didn't confront it now, it would never stop. The house would always have this power over him. It had already taken Max. What else was it going to take? Summoning all his courage, Jake stood up, his legs shaky, and grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen counter. His throat was dry, and his hands were trembling as he walked toward the basement door. He reached for the handle, feeling the cold metal under his fingers, and hesitated for just a second. The creaking stopped. For a moment, everything was still. The house was eerily silent, as if it was holding its breath, waiting for him to make the first move. Jake tightened his grip on the flashlight and slowly opened the basement door. He flicked on the light, but it barely cut through the darkness below. The stairs stretched down into the shadows, and the cold, musty air hit him like a wall as he stepped inside. He descended the steps one by one, each creak of the old wooden boards louder than the last. His heart pounded in his ears as he approached the bottom. When he reached the basement floor, the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. It was freezing down here, colder than it had ever been. His breath came out in visible puffs, and the dim light barely illuminated the space around him. The camcorder, which had died just hours earlier, sat on the floor where he had left it. The red light on it was still dead. No signs of life there. But then something caught his attention. The small hidden door to the strange room was wide open. Jake's stomach dropped. He knew for a fact that he had closed and locked it the night before. His mind reeled, wondering how it could have opened on its own. He felt an overwhelming urge to leave, to run upstairs and pretend he had never seen it. But something kept him rooted to the spot. The open door seemed to beckon him, like it was inviting him inside. Steeling himself, Jake walked over to the door, gripping the flashlight tightly as he shone it into the room. The light barely penetrated the darkness, but he could make out the chair in the center, sitting there as it always had. But something was different this time. The air was thick with tension, like the room itself was holding some terrible secret. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. Something moved. Jake whipped the flashlight around, his heart pounding in his chest. At first, he thought he was seeing things, but there it was again, a shadow, faint and barely noticeable, slipping along the far wall. It was the same shadow he had seen on the camcorder footage, the same figure that had sat in the chair, watching the camera. He took a step back, his mind screaming at him to get out. But before he could turn to leave, the shadow seemed to shift. It wasn't just a flicker anymore. It was taking form, becoming more solid. Jake watched, frozen in place, as the figure stepped forward out of the darkness. It wasn't a person. Not exactly. The thing that emerged from the shadows was tall, unnaturally thin, its limbs long and distorted, its face a vague, blurred mass. It moved toward him slowly, deliberately, and with each step, the room seemed to grow colder. Jake's breath hitched in his throat. He backed away, stumbling over his own feet as the figure glided closer. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to run, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from it. He was trapped in its gaze, or what he imagined was its gaze, frozen by some unseen force. Then, without warning, the thing spoke. Its voice was low, raspy, barely more than a whisper, but the words sent a chill down Jake's spine. "You shouldn't have opened it." The words echoed in the small room, bouncing off the concrete walls and burrowing deep into Jake's mind. He felt his blood turn to ice as the figure stopped just a few feet away, towering over him. Its presence was overwhelming, suffocating, like the air had been sucked out of the room. Jake's legs finally responded, and he stumbled backward, almost falling over as he scrambled out of the room. He slammed the hidden door shut behind him, his hands shaking so badly he could barely twist the lock. For a moment, he just stood there, breathing heavily, his heart racing as the weight of what had just happened settled over him. But the voice echoed in his head. "You shouldn't have opened it." Jake backed away from the door, still clutching the flashlight. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. What had he opened? What had he unleashed by stepping into that room? The house had felt wrong from the start, but now he realized just how deep the darkness went. It wasn't just the house. It was something much older, much darker, and it had been waiting for him all along. Before Jake could fully process what had happened, there was a knock at the front door. He jumped, his heart skipping a beat. The knock was sharp, urgent, and completely unexpected. He hesitated, then rushed upstairs, feeling a mix of dread and hope. Maybe it was a neighbor, or maybe Lisa had come back early. Maybe someone had seen something. Anything. He reached the front door and peered through the peephole. To his surprise, it was Bob and Nancy, the neighbors from across the street. They stood on the porch, their expressions grim, as if they already knew what had been happening in the house. Jake opened the door, and before he could say a word, Bob stepped forward, his voice low and serious. "You need to leave." Jake blinked, taken aback. "What?" Nancy nodded, her usual cheery demeanor replaced by a deep, unsettling concern. "We've been watching the house. We didn't want to scare you, but we've seen this before. It's happening again?" Jake's stomach turned. "What do you mean, again?" Bob's eyes darkened. "The last people who lived here, they found that room too. The room was built to contain something evil. But once it's opened, once you've disturbed it, it doesn't go back." Nancy stepped forward, her voice trembling. "You have to leave, Jake. You can't stay here. If you stay, it'll take you too." Jake stared at them, his mind spinning. He wanted to believe they were wrong, that it was just some old ghost story. But after what he'd seen, after what he had just experienced in the basement, he knew they were right. Whatever was in that room wasn't just a ghost. It was something much worse, something that wasn't going to stop. And now, it had its sights set on him. Jake stood in the doorway, staring at Bob and Nancy, his mind racing. Their words echoed in his head. Asterisk, you have to leave, or it'll take you to Star. The urgency in their voices was unmistakable. And for the first time, Jake realized just how dangerous the situation had become. Whatever was in the house wasn't just a haunting or some strange phenomenon. It was something far more sinister, and he had unknowingly disturbed it. "What do you mean it'll take me?" Jake asked, his voice shaky. He glanced nervously at the basement door, half expecting to see the shadowy figure creeping up the stairs. "What is it?" Bob shifted uncomfortably, exchanging a glance with Nancy. He let out a deep sigh, as if he had been carrying this burden for far too long. "I don't know exactly what it is, but it's not something you can fight. It's older than this house. It's tied to that room, and once you've let it out, there's no going back." Nancy stepped forward, her face pale and drawn. "We didn't tell you because we thought maybe it would stay dormant, that it wouldn't wake up. But the last people who lived here, before you, they disturbed it too. And when they did, things started happening. Things that can't be explained." Jake swallowed hard, his mouth dry. "What happened to them?" Bob's expression darkened, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. They disappeared. No one knows where they went, but one day, they were just gone. The police searched the house, the woods, everywhere, but there wasn't a trace of them. It was like they vanished into thin air. Nancy nodded solemnly. We saw the signs with you, heard about Max, the dreams, the noises. We should have warned you sooner, but we thought maybe it wouldn't happen again. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He felt like the walls were closing in, like the house itself was listening to every word. So what do I do? He asked, panic creeping into his voice. How do I stop it? Bob shook his head slowly. You don't. You can't stop it. The only thing you can do is leave. Get out while you still can, before it takes you to. Jake glanced over his shoulder at the basement door again, the memory of the shadowy figure still fresh in his mind. Every instinct told him to listen to Bob and Nancy, to run as far away from the house as possible. But something inside him hesitated. He had put everything into this house, his money, his energy, his hope for a new life. He couldn't just walk away, could he? But where do I go? Jake asked, feeling a growing sense of desperation. And what if it follows me? Bob stepped forward, putting a hand on Jake's shoulder. His grip was firm, but there was an urgency in his touch. It's tied to the house. As long as you get out and never come back, you should be safe. But you need to go now, Jake. Don't wait. Nancy nodded, her eyes filled with worry. Pack a bag, take whatever you can carry, and leave tonight. We can help you find somewhere to stay for now, but you can't stay here. Not another night. Jake's head spun as he processed their words. He didn't have much time. Whatever was in that room, whatever had taken Max, whatever had appeared on the camera, it was still down there, waiting for its chance to strike again. And if Bob and Nancy were right, his time was running out. Without another word, Jake nodded and quickly stepped back inside the house. He didn't want to be in there any longer than he had to. The air felt heavier now, like the house itself was alive, watching his every move. He rushed upstairs to the bedroom, grabbed a duffel bag from the closet, and started throwing clothes and essentials into it, his hands shaking the entire time. As he packed, his phone buzzed on the nightstand. He glanced at the screen. It was Lisa again. He hadn't told her about Bob and Nancy's warning yet, hadn't told her about the figure in the basement or the fact that something far darker was happening in the house than he had ever imagined. With trembling hands, Jake picked up the phone and texted her, keeping it short and vague. Asterisk, something's wrong with the house. I'm leaving. I'll explain later. Please don't come back. Asterisk. He hesitated for a moment, then sent the message. It was the best he could do without scaring her completely. He couldn't risk her coming back now, not with whatever was lurking in the basement. After a few more minutes of frantic packing, Jake zipped up the bag and slung it over his shoulder. He didn't take much, just enough to get by for a few days. As he headed downstairs, he heard a soft creak coming from the basement, the same slow, deliberate sound that had haunted him for days. His heart raced, but he forced himself to keep moving. He couldn't look back now. Bob and Nancy were still waiting outside when he stepped onto the porch. They both looked relieved to see him, but there was still an unspoken tension hanging in the air. They knew, just as Jake did, that time was running out. Good, Bob said with a firm nod. We'll help you get out of here. You can stay with us for a night, and then we'll figure out the rest. But we have to leave now. Jake nodded, his throat tight. Thank you, he said quietly, though the words felt hollow. He wasn't sure if he was thanking them for helping him escape or for warning him before it was too late. They headed to Bob's car, the three of them walking quickly but quietly, as if they were afraid of waking the house. Jake glanced over his shoulder one last time, his eyes lingering on the front door. The house looked so normal from the outside, just an old place with a few creaks and quirks. But he knew better now. It was a trap, a prison for something far older and more dangerous than any of them could have imagined. As they reached the car, Nancy turned to Jake, her voice soft but urgent. Once you leave, don't ever come back, Jake. Promise me. This house, it won't let you go a second time. Jake swallowed hard, nodding. I won't. Bob started the car, and as they pulled away from the house, Jake felt a strange mix of relief and fear wash over him. He was leaving, but the house, whatever it was still there, still waiting, still watching. As they drove down the street, The house slowly disappeared from view. The knot in Jake's stomach began to loosen, but not completely. He glanced back at the dark, silent road behind them, half expecting to see something following them. But there was nothing, just the empty night. He exhaled, turning back to face the road ahead. For the first time in days, he felt like he could breathe again. He was free. But then his phone buzzed. It was a message from Lisa. "I'm already here, Jake. I'm home. Where are you?" Jake stared at his phone in disbelief. His heart stopped for a moment as Lisa's message sunk in. Asterisk, "I'm already here, Jake. I'm home. Where are you?" Asterisk, "Home?" She was at the house. His pulse raced as panic flooded his chest. He had warned her not to come back. How could she have missed the message? He was supposed to keep her safe, but now she was walking right into the trap, right into that house that had already claimed too much. Jake's hands trembled as he typed back, his fingers fumbling over the screen. Asterisk, "Lisa, get out of the house right now. Don't go into the basement. Just leave." Asterisk. His breath hitched as he waited for her reply, the seconds dragging on like hours. Bob and Nancy exchanged nervous glances from the front seats, their own fear reflected in their eyes. They could sense that something had gone terribly wrong. "What is it?" Nancy asked, her voice trembling. "What happened?" "Lisa, she's back at the house," Jake muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I told her not to come, but she didn't get my message in time. She's there now." Bob cursed under his breath, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "We have to go back, Jake. We can't leave her there." Jake didn't need convincing. "Turn around," he said, his voice tight with fear. "Turn the car around." Bob slammed on the brakes and swung the car in a sharp U-turn, the tires screeching on the pavement. They sped back toward the house, Jake's mind racing. Every second that passed felt like a countdown to disaster. He could feel the weight of the house bearing down on him, as if it was pulling him back into its clutches. His phone buzzed again, and he glanced down, his heart in his throat. Lisa had replied, Asterisk, "I'm fine, Jake. Why do I need to leave? What's going on?" Asterisk. Jake's stomach twisted. She didn't understand the danger. She had no idea what was waiting for her in that house, lurking in the basement. He typed as quickly as he could, his fingers shaking with urgency. Asterisk, "Please, Lisa, just trust me. Don't ask questions. Get out now. I'll explain everything later, but you need to leave. I'm coming back for you, Asterisk." The car sped down the dark streets, the headlights slicing through the night. The house loomed larger in Jake's mind with every passing second. He could see it in his head, its dark windows staring back at him like eyes, watching, waiting. He prayed that Lisa hadn't gone downstairs, that she hadn't gone near that room. As they neared the house, Jake's phone buzzed again. He didn't want to look. He was afraid of what he might see. But he had to know. He glanced down at the screen and felt his blood run cold. Lisa's message was short, and her tone had shifted. It was no longer confused. Now, it was unsettling. Asterisk, "Why would I leave? It's just a house, Jake. Come inside. Everything is fine." Asterisk. Jake's chest tightened with a sickening realization. That wasn't Lisa. It couldn't be. The house, whatever was inside it, it had gotten to her. Just like it had taken Max. Just like it had appeared in his dreams. The thing in the house was imitating her, trying to lure him back. "No," Jake whispered, his voice cracking. "No, no, no." He showed the message to Bob and Nancy, his hands trembling. "It's not her. She's not okay. It's the house. It's messing with her. I have to get her out of there." Bob pressed harder on the gas, and within minutes, they skidded to a stop in front of the house. The porch light was on, casting an eerie glow over the front yard. Everything looked deceptively normal, like nothing was out of place. But Jake knew better. The house was hiding its darkness behind that ordinary facade. Jake didn't wait for Bob or Nancy to say anything. He jumped out of the car, his heart pounding in his ears, and sprinted up the porch steps. His hand hovered over the doorknob for just a second before he forced himself to twist it open. The front door creaked as it swung inward, revealing the dark, quiet interior of the house. Jake stepped inside, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The house felt different, heavier, more oppressive, like the walls were closing in on him. "Lisa," he called out, his voice echoing through the house. "Lisa, where are you?" There was no answer. Jake moved through the house in a panic, checking every room, every corner. The living room was empty. The kitchen was quiet. The upstairs hallway was dark and still. But something was wrong. He could feel it in his bones. The house was too quiet, too still. It was as if the air itself was waiting for him to make the next move. As Jake stood at the bottom of the stairs, trying to figure out where to go next, he heard it. The faint sound of footsteps coming from the basement. His blood ran cold. "Lisa," he called, his voice shaking. No answer. Just the soft, deliberate sound of footsteps descending into the basement. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he approached the basement door. He could feel the house's energy shifting, tightening around him like a trap. The air was thick, suffocating. With a deep breath, he gripped the doorknob and pulled the door open. The basement stairs stretched down into the darkness, just as they always had. But this time, the darkness felt different. It felt alive. "Lisa," Jake called again, his voice small, unsure. He stepped onto the first stair, his legs trembling as he descended. Each step felt like a lifetime. The basement light flickered overhead, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The air grew colder with every step, until Jake's breath came out in visible puffs. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, he froze. There, standing in the center of the basement, was Lisa. Or at least, it looked like Lisa. She stood still, her back to him, staring at the small, hidden door that led to the room. The door was wide open, the dark void beyond it beckoning. Jake's heart lurched in his chest. "Lisa," he whispered, barely able to speak. "What are you doing?" She didn't respond. She didn't move. Something was wrong. Deeply, horribly wrong. Jake took a step closer, his heart in his throat. "Lisa, we need to go. Please come with me." She turned slowly, and when she did, Jake's breath caught in his throat. It was Lisa's face, but there was something off. Her expression was blank, her eyes distant, unfocused, like she wasn't really there. Like she was somewhere else. Her skin was pale, almost gray, and her lips were slightly parted as if she were about to speak, but no words came. "Lisa," Jake's voice cracked with fear. He reached out to her, but as his hand hovered near her arm, a voice, low, raspy, and inhuman, whispered from the darkness of the open room. "You shouldn't have come back." The voice wasn't Lisa's. It was something else. Something old. Something that had been waiting in the house all along. Jake stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest. He had made a terrible mistake. He should have listened. He should have left when he had the chance. As the shadowy figure from the room began to creep forward, swallowing the light around it, Jake realized the horrifying truth. It wasn't just after him. It had already taken Lisa,